We're here today for a briefing on AO 2025-64, which is an ordinance amending Anchorage Municipal Code chapters 2103, 2104, and 2107 to change standards related to site access, building frontage, driveway, and how private properties connect to the public street. We are on the record today from 11:50 to 12:50. We'll start with introductions. Mr. Gerker.
Here. Keith McCormick.
Anna Brawley.
Christopher Constant.
Felix Vera.
On the phone, Ms. Baldwin Day.
I'm here.
All right. And then with the administration, we have
Melissa Babb, Planning Department.
Daniel McKenna Foster, Long Range Planning.
We're just joined by Mr. Johnson. Ms. Brawley.
Thank you. So I'll just speak very briefly and then turn it over to the real experts. This project, myself and Member Voland are sponsors. This project really is a continuation of what I would say is a 4-year saga around this particular piece of code. So I won't go into all that history, but I just really want to emphasize the purpose of this is to fix problems that are already in our code. So last year, well, this was passed a couple years ago. It went through a public process. Originally, it was part of the changes to parking requirements, the number of required parking spaces. It was split out. So this is the other half of that ordinance. It is very technical. It makes a lot of changes. Basically, the assembly passed it, it went into effect, and then immediately it broke a lot of things. Not because it was bad ideas, but because it was not practical to implement. It was confusing to use. And we heard a lot of testimony back in 2024 around kind of projects it was impacting. And so the assembly paused this piece. So I want to separate it also from the multifamily design standards. That's a separate set of code. For the most part, we'll get into where these overlap. But really with the idea that we would step back, really think about what problems this is trying to solve, and then work with developers, work with the community, and work with planning staff. And so we, for several months, have engaged in a process led by Holly Spos-Torres from Huddle, our facilitated contractor, working with planning staff, working with, as I said, a number of community stakeholders to really talk about kind of how we balance making sure that our neighborhoods are safe for pedestrians, walkable, that we have good development, and also recognizing that not everywhere, for example, has alleys. Not everywhere is built in a traditional grid the way that some neighborhoods like South Addition or Mountain View are built. So really trying to balance what the rules should be for the whole city, recognizing there's a variety of contexts out there, and trying to make it simpler than what is there now. So I just want to emphasize that we'll get into what this does and why, but really this is trying to fix a problem that's already there. If we don't take action on this or something else, the original code will go back into effect in November 2025, and it is a problem. So I'm hoping that this is a solution that's better than what we had. So that's really the background, and then I will turn it to planning.
So let me ask a clarifying question. The original code that was amended a couple of years ago,
Yes, yeah, sorry, what went into place in 2023?
that made things an error, not the original code before the action that made everything come to a screeching halt. Okay, thank you. The department.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. This has been a topic of discussion and something we've all been working on for a long time. Assemblymember Brawley mentioned that let the experts do it, but I think through this we all kind of became experts because we had the big working group and it was a really productive. And for at least our department, we're really grateful that so many people came together on this to work through it. So what I'm going to talk about today is sort of a agglomeration of some other presentations we've given at FCC, at Planning and Zoning Commission. Anybody who wants more detailed information, I'd recommend looking at our project page where you can get a little more in-depth view of the slides. So, but we just want to save some time for questions, that sort of thing. So what is site access? It's essentially how a private site interacts with the public street. And it's all the aspects of that, how wide the driveway is, where the doorway is, if there's a walkway from the doorway to the street, what happens at the street, the cut going into the street, curb cuts, what the sidewalks look like. Even in some of these regulations, it was about how the building looks, how many windows there are, and how that influences people walking by and that sort of thing. So this diagram is kind of looking at what does this big packet of stuff do? It sort of addresses many of the things in this picture. So the original site access that came up out of, I think it was AO 2023-50, I believe, it created sort of this new these new geographic areas within which there was a different set of standards for how buildings could look and what driveways could look like and how people could take access from the public street. That set up these two sort of different tiers of standards. Sort of inside that area, you had a more more window requirements, a little bit different about where vehicles could be parked between the building and the street. And outside, it was a little less restrictive. So that created some situations and a lot of uncertainty about what applies where and when. And then, very quickly we heard from development community like Cook Inlet Housing Authority that some of these things were difficult to understand, and it made some of their projects not work. And so we kind of went back. But going back to the very, very beginning, a lot of this started with AO 2022-80, which was about parking and site access standards. And that AO did a lot of different things. It addressed parking and vehicle storage, but it also consolidated a lot of other pieces like alley access or where different standards were. So untangling this was sort of looking at a lot of important consolidation changes that had been made. They'd been moved to different places or different chapters, and then sort of making sure we preserved the stuff that people wanted, people needed, but then removing the stuff that was difficult to use or difficult to implement. So quick timeline, again, January, October 2021, that's when the project sort of began. AO 2022-80 was introduced in September 22, adopted November 22. In July 2023, 2350 was adopted, and that really established these new site access rules with the context areas. And then 2024, they went into effect. Very quickly after that, the Assembly made sort of a call to put them on pause. And then there was a design standards moratorium came in later in the year. And then in late 2024, we began working on edits. So public process, the working group has been working since late 2024. In February 21, we went to the Planning and Zoning Commission, did a work session. We did a local lens presentation through FCC on February 24th. That's recorded. Anybody can go look at that. We went a little more in depth. March 3rd, we went to the Planning and Zoning Commission. And then on May 20th, AO 2025-64 was introduced at the Assembly. So in picture form, sort of what are we dealing with? Anchorage has a lot of places where the car area on private property sort of bleeds into the car area on public property, and it's not always clear. A situation like this is tough for pedestrians because you don't know where their cars are coming or going or where. It's tough for drivers because you don't know what's happening. So there's not a real delineation between public space and private space. So what, a situation like this, basically all the area in red is sort of car space, not car space. It's hard to manage, hard to regulate. So this sort of site access 2, as we're kind of calling it, is attempting to address that. So for example, say you're walking down the street, you don't know there could be a car coming from any side, or you're driving, there could be a car from any side. This type of environment is pretty difficult to manage, to navigate for all users. And it's really difficult to navigate or to manage from the right-of-way perspective, from the municipal perspective. So this is another kind of example, a big frontage, 40-foot wide driveway. And another piece of this is when you have a big driveway like this, that's also kind of allocating that much right of way only for private access use. So curb space is important. Curb space is a public asset. We manage curb space downtown. People use it for loading, pickup, drop off, parking. But when a lot of your curb space is taken up by a driveway, that private property has sort of monopolized that curb space. So nobody can really use it. You can't park in front of a driveway, right? So this is also about managing public curb space and the public right of way as sort of a public asset. So what this new proposal does is it still allows a pretty big driveway. It allows a 28-foot driveway, but it just says beyond that, you have to have some sort of vertical separation. Because a lot of people, they've seen these big, you have some sort of building and then this big parking lot, and people are coming and going from the parking lot all across the property line. This is trying to balance the need. People say, well, we need a 28-foot driveway. That's kind of a commercial, like you can have a one-way in, one-way out, and plenty of separation in between. Allowing that, but also saying you can't just have your whole frontage just kind of coming into the street. So it requires some sort of vertical separation. Vertical separation, kind of a wonky word, but that could be a bollard, could be a boulder, it could be a tree, it could be like a depressed separation. So really it's trying to allow flexibility there, but also trying to establish that some of the right-of-way needs to be protected as right-of-way. It can't just all be driveway space. Another piece of there is snow storage. If you have all driveways onto the street, you have nowhere to store the snow. You can't store snow in front of somebody's driveway. If you have this vertical separation, you're sort of allocating some of that space that will not be for access. It can be used for other things. You could park a car there, you could still store snow there, or it's just easier for people walking along or biking along. Here's another example. So you could have your 28 feet all at once, or you could have 2 12 feet or 2 14 feet, but something like that. You get that allocation, but it's also saying there are limits to how much of the frontage can be driveway. Some other things it does, it talks about covered entrances. So the code requires, and parts of this are already in code, and there's been a lot of support for this. Just making sure that a building always has a covered entrance going to it. And then that's, again, there's more detail. There's a more detailed version of this on the project page, but I'll kind of go through it quickly. Another piece is window requirements. It says 15% of a primary frontage should be visual access windows, and side secondary frontage has to be 10%. So that's sort of a balance. Windows are expensive, and there were a couple high profile cases where somebody said, well, we had to put a window in, so we had to put it in the bathroom. Nobody wants the window in the bathroom, but we had to meet the standard. So this was, again, a compromise. There was a lot of discussion on all this in the working group. Working group had members of the community, members of the development community. And so we had a lot of really good discussions. We also had a number of site visits where people going out and talking about, what were the issues with this, what worked well, what didn't. And I think for all of us, it was a really helpful experience. And it sort of set the standard for the way we'd like to do things moving forward. Yeah, this is the example where the window to the left of the door is into a bathroom, and because it had to comply. And again, maybe there could have been a different design choice. The other thing is the windows on the door. This is done by Cook Inlet, and they said, some of those, if those windows break, we're going to just replace them with a solid door, just because it makes more sense for those properties. Now there have been some questions about the design standards moratorium, which is 2024-104S. And this site access moratorium. So the design standards moratorium came up as we were working through this project, and it imposed a moratorium on a lot of standards, including some of the ones we were working on. So this chart, it shows where there's overlap and which sections of the design standards moratorium would affect which sections of site access. Site access, of course, site access 2, let's call it, it covers a large number of other things. So everything in purple here is stuff that is not covered by the design standards moratorium. And a lot of that stuff is things like alley access, cleaning up, what do you do if you're required to take alley access, but the alley is unbuildable because of slope or something else? So site access has some stuff about design standards, but has a lot of other stuff for needed changes and cleanup and that sort of thing. Also in the slides, this is going sort of section by section. I won't bore anybody with this unless they really want to, about which are the pieces that probably need to be fixed, and which were on hold because of the design standards moratorium, which were on hold because of AO 2024 as amended, which was the one that they submitted to stop the original site access. And then finally, also, there's another one, if you really want to get into it, going back to 2022, looking at the original provisions that were created, how they were affected by 2023-50, and then by 2024-104, and then how they'd be changed by this one. So this is really included for reference, but I'd be glad to answer questions on that.
Ms. Brawley?
Yeah, thanks. Can you clarify and maybe go back to the moratorium slide, the least complicated one? Yeah, thank you. Can you also just clarify what types of development the site access rules generally apply to? Because I think multifamily design standards are multifamily housing, but can you just unpack that a little more? Thanks.
There's some exceptions.
Yeah, the site access standards were pretty universal in scope, so they applied to all sorts: commercial, residential, single family, and multifamily, and even some industrial. So there's a lot in here too, which is like how do you deal with pedestrian access to an industrial facility, or the entrance to an industrial building in an industrial area. So design standards was really about design standards for multifamily, and site access about access for all sites and all zones.
Thanks. Mr. Johnson, go ahead.
Yeah, thanks. I think I asked a similar question when we talked about this at CDC, but just to refresh my memory, you had the picture of somebody's driveway, right? It said 40 feet, we'll make it 28 feet. Now I assume, of course, that for people who've already built their driveways, they're grandfathered in. But what sort of event would trigger them having to conform to that standard, right? I mean, if they said, well, I need to reseal my driveway or something like that, at what point do you cross the line to where you say, okay, now you need to bring it into compliance with the new standard?
That's a great question. And also, we're also working through how do you address nonconformities. So the code says that anytime, in general, the code wants all properties to come into conformity over time. But there's some thresholds in there where if you're doing a project and it's less than, I think it's currently less than 10% of the assessed value, you don't have to go through the process of bringing it into nonconformity. That might also change. So it's a higher threshold. So say your house is worth $100,000 and you're doing $10,000 of work or $9,000 of work, you wouldn't have to make any big changes like that. And that threshold now would be 40,000 or something like that. So it really depends on how much you're changing the property. Like say you're redoing the roof, you probably wouldn't have to change this. But say you're demoing it or adding something new, in those cases, if the threshold was high enough, then it would kick in and say, you also need to address these nonconformities on the property. But for most places, probably not.
Yeah, and I would just add through the chair to Member Johnson that even for those properties that do have to bring their property towards compliance, they only have to spend about 10% of the project fund on doing that. So they wouldn't have to actually fix the nonconformity entirely if they could spend up to 10% of the project fund to bring it towards conformity.
Okay, let me, to make sure I'm following this right, have a semi-hypothetical example. We redid the kitchen in our house recently, and the total project cost was about 20% of the value of the house. So I think enough to meet that baseline threshold. My driveway is not wide enough to be a problem here, but hypothetically, if it was, that would have been such that I would have had to at least say, I'm going to remodel my kitchen, but it turns out that it now triggered an event where I might also have to fix my driveway.
Depending on the value, yes. And also in this, in establishing this standard, you could put a rock. So I'm not saying it's not a burden, but it has to be some sort of vertical, because it's really asserting that, the municipality has an interest in preserving the right of way. And we heard a lot from a lot of people that they don't want to see these big driveways going into the street. But as you pointed out, there are many properties that are not in conformity. And I guess I'll also kind of mention that there is another ordinance coming to planning and zoning in July, I believe, about nonconformities addressing this. And it would make it so you could do more work without triggering the nonconformity, because a lot of people see that and they're like, well, okay, I'm just not going to do the project, or I'm not going to bring a dilapidated building. It's not worth the cost to do it. So that's another piece to sort of address this. But this was sort of thinking, yeah, it doesn't have to be perfect landscaping. It could be a rock, just something that physically solves the problem, but maybe doesn't create too much of a burden, but it is establishing that.
Okay, thanks. And this is not a grave concern for me. I just want to make sure I understand it. And frankly, I think that driveway looks better than the one that was there before. So thank you.
I would note that at 11:54, we were joined by Ms. Silvers, and just now at 12:07 by Member Volland. Anyone in the queue? Anna?
Yeah, thanks. Speaking of driveways, I wonder if you could talk a little bit more, because I know the work group talked a lot about driveway standards. So maybe just clarifying, I should say, we talked about driveway standards and also what is in zoning code versus what is in other places that regulates driveways. So that would be helpful to unpack a little more. And specifically, can you also talk about the rules for where the driveway meets the street versus your own property? Because we kind of talked about, the short version is, we said we're not regulating how much pavement is on your, the rest of your property. It's really just where it meets the street. But if you could talk more about the driveway standards generally.
Through the chair to Member Brawley, I'll address your last question first, that yes, it is correct that we determined via the working group that we would not be addressing the amount of pavement in between the building and the street. So you could pave your entire front yard as long as there's a vertical separation between your paved surface and the right of way. But for the driveway cut itself, do you want to take on the remainder of that?
Yeah, through the chair. So in current code, there's sort of what the zoning code says you can do with the driveway, but also the practices of project management, engineering, the traffic department, because they sort of manage the streets and we manage the zoning code manages the private property. So previously it was sort of that when they're doing a review, they base their sort of allowances for what you can do with the drive off their engineering discretion. And this sort of simplifies it and makes sure that the zoning code and the policies that project management, engineering, and traffic have are the same, so that it's all established in zoning. So, but previously cases there might have been some overlap, or some places where it didn't quite connect, that where the way that project engineering and traffic were regulating and approving driveways didn't necessarily line up with the zoning, and so this is another thing trying to fix that.
Other questions? Feels like, Holly, do you want to speak to the process at all since you're here? You don't have to, but you can. No, okay. Any last comments?
Chair Constant, we would just like to say thank you to the assembly and the contractor, Holly, and all of the working group participants for taking part in this. This, I think, has been a model project for how to update code and involve the community, involve all parts of the muni, and come to a good solution to what has been a years-long discussion. So thank you.
Go ahead, Zach.
Because it feels like we have enough time. I'm sure it's in here. I can dig it up, but this went to PZC, correct? Did PZC come back with any recommended changes?
I don't believe they did. I think because we did so much work on the front end to talk to people about it, and we had a work session with them that I don't think they had even any different findings or changes.
So PZC just recommended adoption as presented?
Yeah, so, when we send something out, we send it for agency review, then we get comments. Sometimes we find little errors. So they recommended the version that we had corrected. So in the packet, let's see if I have it. There's a section where it shows the changes that we made. It's, I don't know, halfway through this packet, it's 8 of 132. But that's what they made the recommendation on, and I believe that's the version that you'll see. So this, I think because we did so much work on the front end, we had so many people involved, and we had so many that was the other thing. There were a lot of department representatives in the working group, so it was really easy to get everybody's support on that because everybody was really working together to find the problem. So yeah, PCC, I think that was one of the shortest meetings we've had because they were like, yeah, it looks good to me. So
All right, thank you.
That's probably.
Yeah, thanks. And I'll just tag on as far as wrap up. Thank you to all of the work group members. It was really productive discussion. I think everybody would agree that they didn't agree on everything, but I think had now a better understanding of these rules and the pros and cons of having this kind of level of regulation. And I know I got feedback from multiple, both community members and the developer folks who said this was a valuable process. So I would certainly encourage planning to use this in the future. I think a lot of our, disputes about zoning or end up being disputes because it boils down to people seeing the other person's interest as being prioritized over theirs. And so this way of learning together was really valuable. So I can't say it's a perfect product, but I'm hoping it's better than what was there right now. So thank you.
Zach.
All right, I promise this will be my last time. First, I'll say I found the PZC resolution. I guess that page is not numbered. That's unfortunate. But I would encourage my colleagues to dig that out because I think it reiterates what's been stated here about the how well the process worked. The other thing I wanted to just maybe ask of the clerk and perhaps my colleagues is, can we just hold on to these packets and not reprint them in their entirety for the agenda just to save 1 or 2 trees? And I'm okay. If possible, I think that'd be nice. And that's it. I'm done. Thank you.
The clerk has ways. So, okay, since we're near the end of our business, I will do what I'm famed for, make our staff very uncomfortable, and say that if you didn't know, Daniel McKenna Foster just celebrated his 40th birthday. And so we'll just celebrate you here. Life begins at 40, so they say. And so congratulations and happy birthday.
thank you. I'm honored. Thanks.
Mhm. All right, mission accomplished. If there's nothing else, we'll stand adjourned. We're going to convene back, I think, at 1 o'clock. So.